My abusive ex-boyfriend tried to ruin my life, but I fought back and won. Hey Reddit, I'm Emma, 27, and I recently went through one of the toughest battles of my life. I was in a relationship with a guy named Jake, 30, who started out charming but turned out to be a nightmare. He was abusive in ways I never thought I'd experience, and it took me years to find the courage to leave. After a long court battle, I finally got justice. Now, I'm picking up the pieces and finding my way back to myself through therapy. Here's the story of how I fought back, won, and began to heal. I met Jake 3 years ago at a mutual friend's party. He was handsome, charismatic, and had this confidence that drew people in. We hit it off immediately, talking and laughing like we'd known each other forever. He made me feel special in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, and when he asked for my number at the end of the night, I didn't hesitate to give it to him. The honeymoon phase. In the beginning, everything was perfect. Jake was attentive, sweet, and always knew how to make me smile. He'd surprise me with flowers, take me on romantic dates, and constantly shower me with compliments. I felt like the luckiest girl in the world. My friends and family adored him, and everyone kept telling me how lucky I was to have found such a great guy. Jake would say things like, "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me," and I'd never felt this way about anyone before. It was intoxicating. I'd never been in a relationship where someone seemed to care so deeply, and I quickly fell head over heels for him. He was my dream come true until he wasn't. He'd call me every morning just to say he was thinking about me, and he'd make grand gestures like planning surprise weekend getaways or cooking dinner for me after a long day. Jake made me feel cherished, and it was easy to get swept up in the whirlwind of his affection. Every time he looked at me, I felt like the center of his world, and I didn't want that feeling to end. We spent nearly every day together, sharing inside jokes, making plans for the future, and indulging in spontaneous adventures. Jake seemed perfect, too perfect, even, and sometimes, I'd catch myself wondering if it was all too good to be true. But I pushed those doubts aside, convinced that I'd finally found my happily ever after. The first red flags. It started with small things. Jake would get jealous if I talked to other guys, even if it was just a casual conversation. He'd make comments about how my friends were a bad influence and how I should spend more time with him instead. At first, I brushed it off as him being protective. I thought it was sweet that he cared so much. The first time I noticed something was off was when we went to a housewarming party hosted by one of my co-workers. I introduced Jake to everyone, and he seemed fine at first, smiling and making small talk. But as the night went on, I noticed him watching me closely, his expression darkening every time I laughed or spoke to someone he didn't know. When we got home, Jake's mood shifted. He accused me of flirting with one of my male co-workers, even though the conversation had been entirely innocent. "You were all over him," he snapped, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you like making me look like an idiot?" I was stunned. "Jake, we were just talking about work," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "You're overreacting." Jake scoffed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You're always doing this, Emma. You act like you're so innocent, but I see the way you look at other guys." I tried to reassure him, but it didn't matter. Jake was convinced that I was out to hurt him, and no amount of reasoning would change his mind. I felt trapped, torn between wanting to defend myself and wanting to keep the peace. That night, I apologized just to end the argument, even though I knew I'd done nothing wrong. It was easier than fighting, but it set a dangerous precedent. The escalation of abuse. As the months went on, Jake's behavior got worse. He'd criticize everything I did, from the way I dressed to the people I hung out with. He'd call me names, telling me I was stupid, worthless, and that no one else would ever love me. He'd isolate me from my friends, guilt-tripping me whenever I wanted to spend time with them. I slowly stopped going out, afraid of what Jake would say or do if I didn't put him first. The first time he laid a hand on me, we were arguing about money. I'd bought a new dress for a friend's wedding, and Jake lost it when he saw the price tag. "You're so irresponsible," he yelled, his face flushed with anger. "You spend money like it grows on trees, and then you expect me to pick up the slack." I tried to explain that I'd saved up for the dress, that it wasn't an impulse buy, but Jake wasn't listening. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful, and shoved me backward. I stumbled, shocked by the sudden aggression, and when I looked up at him, I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. But it was fleeting. Jake quickly composed himself, muttering an apology that felt half-hearted at best. "I'm sorry," he said, but his tone was flat, devoid of any real remorse. "You just make me so mad sometimes." I wanted to believe him. I told myself that it was a one-time thing, that Jake didn't mean it, and that if I just tried harder, I could keep him happy. But the truth was, it was never about me. Jake's anger was his own, and it didn't matter what I did or didn't do. The abuse escalated from there, becoming a terrifying cycle of apologies, promises, and broken boundaries. Over time, Jake's abuse became a part of my daily life. I learned to anticipate his moods, tiptoeing around anything that might set him off. I stopped seeing my friends and rarely spoke to my family, too embarrassed to let anyone know what was really going on. I put on a brave face, pretending that everything was fine, but inside, I was crumbling. Isolation and control. Jake had a way of making me feel like I was the problem. He'd twist every argument, turning it back on me until I was apologizing for things I hadn't even done. He'd gaslight me constantly, making me question my own reality. If I tried to call him out on his behavior, he'd accuse me of being overdramatic or paranoid. "You're imagining things," he'd say dismissively. "I'm not doing anything wrong. You're just too sensitive." His manipulation was so subtle and insidious that I didn't even realize how much control he had over me. I'd look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back. I'd lost weight, stopped taking care of myself, and felt like a shell of who I used to be. I was exhausted, anxious, and constantly on edge, but I didn't know how to get out. One night, Jake came home drunk and in a foul mood. I tried to keep the peace, cooking his favorite meal and doing everything I could to avoid a fight. But nothing I did was good enough. He started yelling at me for no reason, accusing me of cheating on him while he was at work. I'd heard this accusation countless times before, but that night, something in me snapped. "I can't keep doing this, Jake," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm not cheating on you. I've never done anything but love you." Jake's face contorted with rage. He grabbed me by the shoulders, shaking me violently. "You're lying," he screamed. "You're always lying." He threw me to the ground, and I felt the air leave my lungs as I hit the floor. I curled up, shielding myself as he continued to scream obscenities at me. When he finally stormed out of the room, I lay there for what felt like hours, sobbing and feeling utterly broken. I knew then that I couldn't keep living like this, but I was too scared to leave. The breaking point. The breaking point came when Jake's violence reached a level I couldn't ignore. One night, after another heated argument, he threw a glass at me. It shattered against the wall, and a shard of glass cut my arm. Blood trickled down, and for the first time, I realized that Jake could actually kill me. I spent the night at a friend's house, too afraid to go back home. When my friend saw the cut on my arm, she begged me to leave Jake for good. "Emma, this isn't love," she said, her voice filled with concern. "He's going to hurt you worse next time. You need to get out." Hearing her say it out loud made it real. I broke down, finally admitting to someone just how bad things had gotten. My friend helped me pack some of my things and encouraged me to stay with her until I figured out my next steps. It was the first time in years that I felt like I wasn't alone, and it gave me the courage to take the next step. I filed a restraining order against Jake the next day. The process was terrifying, but I knew it was the only way to protect myself. Jake tried to contact me, sending messages filled with apologies and promises that he'd change. But I'd heard it all before, and this time, I was done believing him. I blocked his number, changed the locks on my apartment, and started to rebuild my life one day at a time. After leaving Jake, I felt a sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. Jake didn't take the restraining order well, and he became more aggressive in his attempts to contact me. He'd show up at my workplace, leave threatening notes on my car, and even tried to turn my friends against me by spreading lies about our relationship. It was exhausting, and I knew that if I didn't take legal action, he'd never leave me alone. Filing charges against Jake. With the support of my friends and family, I decided to press charges against Jake for assault and harassment. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but I knew it was the right one. The thought of facing him in court terrified me, but I couldn't let him continue to control my life. I needed to stand up for myself and make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. The legal process was long and grueling. I spent hours with my lawyer, recounting every painful detail of our relationship. I had to provide evidence of the abuse, photos of my injuries, screenshots of threatening messages, and witness statements from friends who had seen Jake's behavior firsthand. Reliving those moments was like ripping open old wounds, but I knew it was necessary. Jake, of course, denied everything. He painted himself as the victim, claiming that I was lying and trying to ruin his life. He hired an aggressive lawyer who tried to discredit me at every turn, digging into my personal life and twisting my words to make me look unstable. It was humiliating and degrading, but I refused to back down. The courtroom showdown. The day of the trial was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. I walked into the courtroom, my heart pounding in my chest as I saw Jake sitting at the defendant's table. He glared at me, his eyes filled with hatred, and for a moment, I felt the familiar fear creeping back in. But then I remembered why I was there, to take back my power and make sure Jake couldn't hurt me or anyone else again. My lawyer was incredible. She guided me through my testimony, helping me stay calm and focused as I told the court about the abuse I'd endured. I spoke about the verbal, emotional, and physical torment Jake had put me through, and I could see the jury's expression shift as they listened. It was clear that Jake's lies were unraveling, and for the first time, I felt like people believed me. When it was Jake's turn to testify, he tried to paint himself as the loving boyfriend who'd been misunderstood. He blamed his actions on stress, alcohol, and his troubled past, hoping to gain sympathy from the jury. But his performance fell flat. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attempts to manipulate the narrative only made him look more guilty. The cross-examination was brutal. My lawyer tore apart Jake's story, exposing his lies and highlighting the inconsistencies in his testimony. By the time she was done, Jake was visibly shaken, his confidence shattered. It was a small victory, but it gave me the strength to keep going. The support of friends and family. Throughout the trial, my friends and family were my rock. They showed up to every court date, sitting in the gallery and offering their silent support. My mom held my hand during breaks, whispering words of encouragement, while my best friend, Sarah, kept me grounded with her humor and lighthearted banter. One afternoon during a recess, Sarah pulled me aside, her eyes filled with determination. "You're so strong, Emma," she said, squeezing my shoulders. "Don't let him intimidate you. You've got this." Their unwavering support reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight. For so long, I'd felt isolated and powerless, but now, I was surrounded by people who believed in me and wanted to see me win. It was a stark contrast to the control Jake had wielded over me, and it fueled my resolve to keep going. The verdict. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict, guilty on all counts. Jake was sentenced to jail time for his abuse, and the court granted me a permanent restraining order. Hearing the judge read the sentence was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I'd won. I'd finally stood up to my abuser and gotten the justice I deserved. Jake was furious. As he was led out of the courtroom, he shot me one last venomous glare, but I didn't flinch. I'd spent years being afraid of him, but now, I felt nothing but relief. I was free, and I knew I'd never have to see him again. Leaving the courthouse that day felt like walking out of a dark tunnel and into the light. I breathed deeply, savoring the fresh air and the sense of freedom that had been so elusive for so long. My friends and family hugged me, their cheers and tears of joy filling the air. It was a moment of triumph, not just over Jake, but over the fear that had controlled me for years. Winning the court case was a huge victory, but it was only the beginning of my healing journey. The trauma of Jake's abuse had left deep scars, and I knew I couldn't move forward without help. With the encouragement of my friends and family, I decided to start therapy. It was a step I'd been hesitant to take, but I knew it was necessary if I wanted to truly heal. Finding the right therapist. Finding the right therapist wasn't easy. I wanted someone who understood the complexities of abuse and could help me process the trauma I'd been through. After a few consultations, I found Dr. Harper, a compassionate and experienced therapist who specialized in trauma and abuse recovery. From our first session, I knew I was in the right place. Dr. Harper made me feel safe, validated, and heard. She didn't judge me for staying with Jake as long as I did, and she helped me understand that the abuse wasn't my fault. We spent our sessions unpacking the emotional manipulation, the fear, and the guilt that had kept me trapped for so long. It was painful to confront those memories, but it was also liberating. Unraveling the trauma. One of the hardest parts of therapy was confronting the shame I felt about my relationship with Jake. I blamed myself for not leaving sooner, for ignoring the red flags, and for believing his empty promises. Dr. Harper helped me see that Jake's behavior was not a reflection of my worth, it was a reflection of his own issues and insecurities. "You didn't cause this, Emma," she said during one particularly emotional session. "Jake's actions were his choices. You did the best you could in an incredibly difficult situation." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For so long, I'd carried the burden of Jake's abuse, believing that I was somehow responsible. But therapy was helping me reframe those thoughts and see the truth. I was a victim of his manipulation, but I was also a survivor. We also worked on rebuilding my sense of self-worth. Jake's constant criticism had eroded my confidence, leaving me feeling small and unimportant. Dr. Harper encouraged me to reconnect with the things I loved, my hobbies, my friends, and my passions. I started painting again, something I'd abandoned during my relationship with Jake, and it became a therapeutic outlet for my emotions. Dr. Harper introduced me to grounding techniques, which became crucial for managing my anxiety. She taught me how to use mindfulness to stay present and connected to my surroundings, rather than being pulled back into the painful memories. We also worked on self-compassion exercises, helping me replace the negative self-talk that Jake had ingrained in me with kinder, more supportive thoughts. Reclaiming my independence. Therapy also helped me reclaim my independence. Jake had isolated me from so much of my life, but now, I was slowly reconnecting with the people and activities that made me feel whole. I reached out to old friends, apologizing for my absence and explaining what I'd been going through. To my surprise, they welcomed me back with open arms, offering their support and understanding. I also started setting boundaries, something I'd never been good at before. Dr. Harper taught me that it was okay to say no, to prioritize my own needs, and to walk away from situations that made me uncomfortable. I practiced assertiveness in our sessions, role-playing scenarios where I stood up for myself, and slowly, I began to feel more confident in my ability to protect my own well-being. One of the most empowering moments came when I attended a support group for survivors of domestic abuse. Listening to other women share their stories, I realized that I wasn't alone. We'd all been through different experiences, but the pain, fear, and shame were universal. We supported each other, offering advice, comfort, and a sense of community that I hadn't felt in a long time. I began journaling as part of my healing process, writing down my thoughts, feelings, and reflections after each therapy session. It helped me track my progress, recognize patterns, and celebrate small victories. On days when I felt overwhelmed, I'd look back at my journal entries and remind myself of how far I'd come. As the months went on, I started to rebuild my life. I moved into a new apartment, a bright and cozy space that felt like a fresh start. I decorated it with things that made me happy: plants, artwork, and soft, colorful blankets. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could finally feel safe. Reconnecting with loved ones. One of the most important steps in my recovery was reconnecting with my family. I distanced myself from them during my relationship with Jake, too ashamed to let them see the truth. But now, I was ready to let them back in. I sat down with my parents and told them everything, from the first signs of Jake's abuse to the court battle that had set me free. My mom cried, holding me tightly as I recounted the details. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I wish I'd known. I wish I could have helped." My dad, who'd always been my protector, looked devastated. "You're so strong," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm proud of you for getting out." Their support meant the world to me. For so long, I'd felt isolated and alone, but now, I was surrounded by people who loved me unconditionally. We spent more time together, going out for family dinners, movie nights, and weekend hikes. It was like I was rediscovering a part of myself that I'd lost, and I cherished every moment. I also reached out to my brother, who lived out of state. We hadn't been close in recent years, but when I told him what I'd been through, he immediately flew in to see me. We spent the weekend catching up, talking about everything from our childhood memories to my plans for the future. Having his support made me feel even more determined to keep moving forward. Focusing on my career. I also threw myself into my work. I'd put my career on the back burner during my relationship with Jake, but now, I was determined to make up for lost time. I started taking on new projects, attending networking events, and even pursued a certification that I'd been putting off for years. My hard work paid off when I was promoted to a leadership position, a goal I'd once thought was out of reach. Work became a source of pride and fulfillment. I loved the challenges, the sense of accomplishment, and the knowledge that I was building something for myself. My colleagues, who'd once only seen the polished, put-together version of me, now knew the whole story. They supported me through my ups and downs, offering encouragement and celebrating my successes. I also began mentoring a junior employee, helping her navigate the early stages of her career. It felt good to be able to give back, to use my own experiences to guide someone else. She reminded me of myself at that age, eager, driven, and full of potential, and it was rewarding to watch her grow. Exploring new passions. As I continued to heal, I started exploring new passions and hobbies. I joined a local art class, picking up new techniques and meeting people who shared my love of creativity. I also took up yoga, finding peace in the quiet moments of meditation and movement. It became a way to reconnect with my body, to reclaim the physical space that Jake had once violated. I also started volunteering at a women's shelter, offering support to other survivors of abuse. It was incredibly rewarding to be able to give back, to use my experiences to help others who were going through similar struggles. I'd sit with the women, listen to their stories, and offer whatever advice or comfort I could. It was a reminder of how far I'd come and how much strength I'd found along the way. Through volunteering, I met other women who had survived similar experiences. We bonded over shared struggles, and those connections became a vital part of my support system. We'd meet for coffee, attend workshops together, and lean on each other during tough days. It was like having a second family, one that understood my journey in a way few others could. As I continued to heal, I found myself thinking less and less about Jake. The nightmares that had once haunted my sleep became less frequent, and the anxiety that had plagued me for so long started to fade. I was no longer defined by what he'd done to me, I was reclaiming my identity, piece by piece. Forgiving myself. One of the most important lessons I learned in therapy was the power of self-forgiveness. I'd spent so long blaming myself for the abuse, convinced that I could have done something differently to prevent it. But Dr. Harper helped me see that the only person responsible for Jake's actions was Jake. "I forgive you, Emma," I said to myself one day in therapy, tears streaming down my face. It was a simple statement, but it felt like a turning point. I was finally letting go of the guilt, the shame, and the self-blame that had weighed me down for so long. Dr. Harper encouraged me to write a letter to myself, one that acknowledged my pain but also celebrated my resilience. I poured my heart into it, writing about the fear, the anger, and the courage it took to leave. It was cathartic, and when I finished, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing for so long. Building a future without fear. As I moved forward, I focused on building a future that was free from fear. I set new goals for myself, both personal and professional, and took steps to achieve them. I traveled to new places, met new people, and embraced every opportunity that came my way. I was living my life on my own terms, and it felt incredible. I also continued my therapy journey, not because I was still struggling, but because I valued the growth and self-awareness it brought me. Dr. Harper became more than just a therapist, she was a guide, helping me navigate the complexities of my past and find peace in the present. I set up a vision board in my apartment, filled with photos, quotes, and reminders of the life I was building. It was a daily visual affirmation of my goals and dreams, and it kept me motivated on days when doubt or fear crept in. I no longer saw myself as a victim, I was a survivor, and my future was mine to shape. Dating again, on my own terms. Eventually, I felt ready to start dating again. It was a scary step, but I knew that I deserved love and happiness. I approached it cautiously, taking my time to get to know new people and making sure that I set clear boundaries from the start. I met a few nice guys, went on some fun dates, and even began a new relationship with someone who treated me with the respect and kindness I'd always deserved. He knew about my past, and he never once judged me for it. Instead, he supported me, listened to my stories, and celebrated my journey of healing. It was a refreshing change, and it reminded me that not all men were like Jake. There were good people out there, and I was worthy of being loved. We took things slow, building a relationship based on trust, mutual respect, and open communication. He never pushed me to share more than I was comfortable with, and he was patient with me on days when my anxiety flared up. It was a new kind of love, one that was healthy, nurturing, and free of the chaos I'd known before. Looking to the future. Looking back, I'm amazed at how far I've come. My journey from abuse to recovery was filled with pain, fear, and uncertainty, but it was also marked by resilience, strength, and hope. I fought back against the person who tried to break me, and I won not just in court, but in reclaiming my life. I'm still healing, and I know that the scars of my past will always be there. But they no longer define me. I'm Emma, a survivor, an artist, a friend, and so much more. I've learned to value myself, to set boundaries, and to never settle for less than I deserve. Thank you for listening, Reddit. This journey has been one of the most challenging experiences of my life, but it's also shown me the power of courage, self-respect, and the importance of finding your own path to healing. Here's to moving forward, to living boldly, and to never letting anyone steal your light.